Thank you so much for inviting me. I don't usually think about these issues that we're talking about today. It's really fascinating for me, but I have done this one project that was published in this special issue, and that's what I want to tell you about today. So I come at these questions as a developmental psychologist who's interested in kind of basic cognition. I'm particularly interested in young children, preschool-age children, and some of my interests led me into the direction of looking at how kids think about privacy issues with mobile technology. So I want to start with a little two-question survey for you. So how many of you have something on your phone that allows you to find it if you lose it? I do. Okay, so several of you. How many of you would like to have a device on your phone that would let a stranger track your phone at any moment in time? Not surprisingly, no one raised their hand.
We all do.
Yeah, right, you all do, but do you want it? This is basically the issue that we were looking at from the standpoint of how these intuitions might change over time. And I'll tell you the conclusion before I present any data, which is that children's intuitions about these privacy issues are very different, or at least young children's intuitions about these privacy issues are very different from those of adults. And then I'll talk about what the implications of this might be and what we might want to do about it. So we know that tracking devices are everywhere. You can put them on your keys, you can put it on your backpack, put them on your pets. You can even inject them. You can put them on your kids. And they've gotten really tiny, which means they can be concealed. And people can have tracking devices that others are not even aware of. And people, I think, have this sort of mixed reaction to these things. So I really like this headline, that Google's new Clips camera is invasive, creepy, and perfect for a parent like me. So there's this sort of tension between, on the one hand, it's perfect, it's useful, you can, find your stuff in ways that you couldn't do before, but at the same time, it's creepy. I want to think a little bit about why is it creepy, what's going on there. And I think there are at least two pieces to this, which is, one is there are true potential harms of your privacy being violated, people being able to track where you are at all times. Someone could stalk you, someone could maybe find moments where you're vulnerable and steal your stuff or your information. So there are true negative consequences of not being able to control the privacy of your belongings. But at the same time, there are sort of moral considerations that are above and beyond the actual harmful consequences. And this gets into that comment that it's creepy. There's a sense in which there seems to be like something morally repugnant about somebody else having that control over your stuff, or even ability to just peek in and see where your belongings are, that doesn't seem right in some kind of very fundamental way. So if you ask adults, most say that they are very concerned about digital privacy issues. So this is an older survey. It was a national survey with 1,000 adults, and minimal requirements for being in the survey. These just had to be people at least 18 who had either at least some online presence or had at least sent or received email. So it's practically everyone could qualify for this. And they asked people a bunch of questions about what their attitudes were toward privacy. And I'll just walk you through, and you'll see there's kind of a consistent picture where people are kind of suspicious and protective of their privacy. Have you ever refused to give information to a business or company because you thought it was not really necessary or was too personal? Vast majority said yes. Generally speaking, anyone who uploads a photo or a video of me to the internet where I am clearly recognizable should first get my permission. Vast majority agree. Do you think there should be a law that gives people the right to know everything that a website knows about them? Vast majority said yes. And compared to 5 years ago, would you say you're more concerned about privacy issues on the internet, less concerned, or you have the same level of concern? And most people either said more or the same. So there's a sense that just, you know, as technology gets more and more sophisticated, the potential for these violations may be increasing. So we were interested in how kids think about this. You know, there's been a lot of work on how adults think about this. What about young children? And this seems, you know, increasingly relevant if you look at children's mobile technology use and what they have available to them. So this is just, you know, a few scattered factoids from different surveys that have been done. But back in 2009, 31% of children 8 to 10 years of age owned a cell phone. In a 2013 survey, 72% of kids 8 or under had used a mobile device for media, and 38% of children under the age of 2. So it's getting, you know, younger and younger. 2016, the average age of a first phone was 10.3 years. You know, when kids have their own phone, you know, they're out and about, not under the sort of direction and protection of the parents in all cases. And in a recent survey just came out this year, children 8 and younger spent on average 48 minutes a day on mobile devices. And of course, these mobile devices are the ones that are particularly easy to track. So, you know, this potentially exposes kids to risks that they wouldn't have experienced before. So how are children thinking about this? And we had 2 very different predictions about what we might find. And really, actually going into this, I was quite unsure. And if anything, if I'm going to be honest, I think the results we did obtain were not what I predicted. So one possibility is that children might view digital tracking as what people call an ownership right. We know that kids really care about property and ownership. A huge percentage of their disputes with one another are over property and, you know, who has the right to own what. They care about it. One of the very first words that children learn is mine. So it's something that they're thinking a lot about, at least by toddler age. And the other thing that's really interesting is that from like careful, kind of rigorous experimental studies of how kids reason about ownership, we know that by, again, 2 or 3 years of age, children are quite sensitive to kind of what the appropriate consequences are if somebody violates ownership rules. They know who has the rights over an object, that the original owner of an object has more rights than, you know, somebody else who might just be sitting right next to it. And they're quite sophisticated in thinking about the social relationships involved between an owner, an object, and another person in the same context. So given all of that, if they think of tracking an object as sort of one more ownership right, then you might expect that there'd be these early emerging intuitions about about privacy with digital technology. On the other hand, children might view digital tracking as innocuous. And I think there are a couple of differences between how you think about objects and the right that an owner has to controlling an object versus information, which is what we're talking about with digital tracking, that make them potentially very different in children's minds. So if you think about, they're fighting over this bottle, if one person, let's say that the bottle belonged to this child and then this one's trying to take it away, well, if this one maintains, gets their hands on that bottle, then she's depriving the first child of that object. It's only one person or the other can have it. They can't both be drinking from it at the same time. That's really different from information. If someone kind of looks over my shoulder and sees, kind of my information, where am I, what am I doing, what, site am I on or whatever, that doesn't deprive me of the right to continue doing what I'm doing. So that's a big difference. And then a second kind of related distinction is if somebody else gets their hands on my stuff, they might not take care of it properly. They might lose it, they might break it, they might, get it dirty, whatever. And so again, with physical objects, kids really, they understand those consequences and really protect their own things. But again, you're not going to necessarily have any of those effects, or those effects won't be obvious when it's information as opposed to a physical object. Oh, and by the way, feel free to interrupt at any time if there's anything that you have questions about or want to comment on. Okay, so what I plan to do is tell you about a series of 3 experiments. This is very kind of simple experiments that are designed for preschool children to get at how they think about these privacy concerns. So in each one, we demonstrated a digital tracking device for children. And basically, we asked them, is this a good thing or a bad thing to use this technology? And the critical manipulation was whether the tracker is the owner of the object being tracked or not. So very simple again, does that make a difference in kids' judgments? So the first experiment looks at how kids think about tracking. It's with preschoolers between 4 and 5 and college students. And we first had a training portion where the kids came into the lab. We showed them a tracker. We called it a button. We explained it was very special and that you could always see where it is on the computer. And then we had a series of interactions where they got to move the button around on different parts of the room or even outside of the room, and then they looked on the computer and they could see that, when the button was here on the couch, it shows up here on the couch, and when it was on the table, it showed up on the table, and so forth. And we had various questions to make sure that even the youngest children were tracking this, and they did understand this quite well. And then we asked a series of questions, either some were about the self tracking, and some were about another person tracking. So the self question, we would show them a picture of an object, say a backpack. We'd say, this is your backpack. Is it okay for you to put the button on your backpack to keep track of it? And the other question was identical, except there was this other kid, Sam. Is it okay for Sam to put the button on your backpack? to keep track of it. And we had 4 items for the self and 4 items for Sam. So they made judgments about 8 items. And the participants were the child's own backpack, the child's own special object. So I have a teddy bear here, but they got to say what their special object was. Often it was something like a teddy bear, but it was something that there's other research showing that kids get very attached to particular objects and feel very closely connected to them. So we're interested in that change. Their pet, if they had one, if they didn't have one, they came up with what they would like to have as a pet, and then reason about that. And we even included the child's own elbow, with the idea being this seems like the ultimate intrusion for adults. You know, someone's tracking your body, you know, through space and time. So we wanted to kind of push the boundaries a bit. So here are the data where kids and college students, how often they said that this tracking was okay or not okay on average, and everything above this line is a positive response. This is a good thing, this is okay, and everything below that line is no, it's not okay. So preschoolers basically said it was okay whether they were tracking their own stuff or this stranger was tracking their stuff, although there was a significant difference. So they didn't think it was as good when someone else was doing it, but it was still on average fine. And the college students also showed a difference between self and other, but not surprisingly, they thought it was great for them to be able to track their own stuff and really not a good thing for somebody else to be able to track their stuff. So we thought it was particularly interesting, this really qualitative difference between the preschoolers who did not seem troubled by this stranger tracking their stuff and the college students who thought it was obviously objectionable. We also looked at their explanations, and I'm going to focus on their moral explanations. There are a whole range of explanations that people provided. The moral ones were particularly interesting to us. These are examples from ones that adults gave. It's an invasion of privacy because she could steal it. I think it's wrong because it's not yours and you really shouldn't be looking for it. So, you know, some of them did talk about these negative consequences, but some just appealed to kind of basic moral principles of privacy and ownership. Yeah?
One question about the last slide. When you were dealing with the toddlers and they're lower for the others, is it everybody's somewhat lower on others, or were they sort of split and that some people thought it was equivalent and some people thought it was worse for others?
Very few. So the question that we posed was actually a 2-part question. First we said, is it okay or not okay? And then we gave them a scale where they could indicate how good it was or how not good it was. The preschoolers very rarely said it was not okay. So the differences, so I mean, yes, this is the average, but there were very few that said, yeah, most of them just weren't rating it as, you know, positively as the others, but it was just a handful who actually had a negative response at all.
This is not looking at that other part, it's only looking at the
No, it is what we looked at it both ways and it came out the same way, but this is using the composite. So it was either a positive or a negative multiplied by their 1 through 5 scale.
Yeah,
So yeah.
It strikes me the interesting question is when they, so were they uniform in distinguishingly just didn't distinguish as much? Or were they,
Yes, they were uniform.
inconsistent on whether they distinguished?
They were uniform, well, not every child distinguished, but most children did distinguish, which is why, you know, this came out as a significant difference. You know, some were the same. Most of them distinguished. There were some that went the other way, but that's testing preschoolers. You always get, you know, some variability like that. But for the most part, I would say the typical response was a difference, a slight difference in how good. They thought it was really good if they could track it, and it was like somewhat good if someone else could track it. But I do have the numbers, like if you're interested, especially when in the third experiment we looked at 4 through 10, and there that question comes up again, like what are individual kids doing as opposed to the average for the group, and you know, I could pull up that chart at that point if that would be of interest. Okay, so these moral explanations. So I'll show you how often they appealed to moral explanations. Now, the preschoolers were more likely to provide some sort of moral rationale when they were explaining why they answered as they did for someone else tracking versus the self, and the college students did as well. But the rate at which they talked about moral considerations was, again, much lower for children than adults. So there's some sensitivity here, but really a very different approach on the whole. And we noticed something interesting about some of the kids' explanations. So this is, I'm just giving you, you know, one adult explanation and one kid explanation to kind of illustrate. So the adults very often did say something like this: that's a breach of privacy. The kids often talked about some physical aspect of the tracker, like it might fall off. Sometimes that was a reason that they said it wasn't as good, because the button might fall off. Now you might think, well, why should it matter then if it's self versus other? So, you know, I think at some level maybe there's some discomfort with the other, but they're not exactly sure why. So they say, oh, the button might fall off. Here's another example. He has no business to know where I am at all times. That's a very typical adult response. You can't touch anybody's backpack, is something that, like the kids said. So now we were starting to worry that maybe kids aren't troubled by tracking at all. Maybe they just don't like somebody physically putting a button on their stuff. Maybe they don't like people touching their stuff. So we felt that that was something that we would have to kind of control for or look at. So just to conclude this experiment, preschoolers as well as college students were relatively more negative about a stranger versus herself tracking their own items. But at the same time, there was a striking change with age in the absolute level of their judgments, where college students said, this is okay if a stranger, this is not okay if a stranger tracks their stuff, but preschoolers seem to be fine with it. But at the same time, it's not clear if children were focused on tracking of information or if really they were more focused on physical contact. So we did a second experiment where it was exactly the same, only there was no digital tracking at all. There was a button that was placed on these same items, no tracking. Again, 4 to 5-year-old children and college students. Again, we said the button was really special, but there was no mention of any digital connection, no ability to track. This button is really special. You can put it on places and things. We had a very similar warm-up where they placed it in different parts of the room and outside of the room, but there was no computer screen tracking where the button was. Again, there were a series of self-questions, a series of other questions. Is it okay for you to put the button on your backpack? Is it okay for Sam to put the button on your backpack? Okay, so exact same items as before. And is this okay or not okay? So you might want to think about how you might answer it, but I'll show you what we found. So preschoolers, again, were more positive about themselves than somebody else placing the button. Remember, in this case, there was no tracking. And again, it was a small difference, but it was there. And the college students also showed a difference. And again, it was larger than with the preschoolers. But if you'll remember from the first study, this time both the preschoolers and the college students are in the same direction, although this was at chance. Their college students were essentially at 0. They had been very negative in the first study. When there's no digital tracking involved, they're like neutral on it. But the preschoolers are actually significantly now below 0, whereas they had been above 0 in the first experiment. So what this means, if you compare the two experiments, is first let's look at the self questions. They're more positive about putting this button on their elbow and their pet and so forth if it has positive consequences of being able to track the thing than if there are no positive consequences. And that's true for the college students as well. But then, for somebody else tracking, it's also more positive to put the button on and track than to put the button on with no tracking. Whereas with college students, it's the exact opposite. So here, this was a significant difference. They were more negative when it was just putting the button on rather than tracking. And college students, it became more positive when you're just putting the button on and not tracking. So it's like the preschoolers can see the benefits of tracking. They understand the idea of maybe not finding something that they want. They think it's cool to be able to use this device to find things, and that's why they're more positive about it. When that benefit is no longer there, then it loses that positive quality. But for college students, someone else tracking their stuff, this has that moral component, the lack of privacy. That person doesn't have the right because it's my information. And so you see that it's worse to track than just to put the button on. So I thought that interaction was quite interesting. Dave?
Yeah, I'm interested in the college student reactions because I can imagine so many of them designated their iPhone as their special object.
Yes,
And
they did.
And I would imagine many of them would know that they're being tracked on their iPhone.
We do have what they said was their favorite object. We didn't do that analysis, and that would be really fascinating to do. Because the prediction should be that when it was the iPhone, then here it should still be negative because they know that tracking. Oh no. They should know.
It would be interesting to know that. I mean, they could be perfectly content with saying, no, I don't want anybody tracking me. I'm perfectly fine with the tracking on my iPhone. I can imagine college students actually being able to live with that contradiction. But it would be interesting to see if they have that contradiction in their head or are bothered by that contradiction at all.
Yeah. Right. That's a good idea. Yeah, and we can do that because we have the data.
I'd be fascinated with how they deal with it.
And it does go back to that quote. It's creepy and perfect for me, so there is that contradiction, I think.
Right.
Okay, so moral explanations. In experiment 2, we found no difference for the preschoolers, and again, a difference for the college students. Okay, so college students view merely placing a device in order to track other people's stuff. Sorry, I said that wrong. They view placing a device with the ability to track worse than just placing the device. And preschoolers saw it the opposite way. Merely placing a device was worse than if you do it for the goal of tracking. At least you have like some positive consequence of being able to track. So if you take away the tracking function, it removes the benefits of potentially finding lost items. It left only the costs of touching somebody else's stuff. So it suggests that young children view tracking devices strictly in terms of their benefits and may be unaware of their dangers. So we conducted another experiment where now we took away that whole putting the tracker on somebody's stuff, because that's like a whole kind of separate factor for kids, and we just asked about tracking. So in this experiment, every time the button was put on something, the owner was putting the button on, and then the person doing the tracking was either the owner or a non-owner. And of particular interest to us was when would we see this sensitivity to privacy concerns coming in. So instead of just looking at the youngest kids, 4 to 5, we looked all the way up to 10 years of age, and again, college students. As I mentioned, given the results of the second experiment, we controlled for physical contact with the objects. And again, we varied who the owner was, whether it's the participant or a stranger. Actually, this is different from the first two experiments, because in the first two experiments, the owner was always the participant. So this allowed us to look at how kids think about it when someone else is tracking their stuff, as well as when they are tracking somebody else's stuff. And we thought there may be an asymmetry there. So it's like before, this button's really special. You can always see where it is on the computer. We had the whole training thing. We had the comprehension questions, make sure that they understood and remembered. And the questions this time were not about placing and tracking, but just about tracking. So this is an example of when the child owned the object and engaged in tracking. Is it okay for you to look on a computer to see where your backpack is? This would be, again, a self question, but third person for this other kid. Is it okay for Sam to look on a computer to see where his backpack is? And then the other questions, which vary depending on whether the owner was the self or other. Is it okay for Sam to look on a computer to see where your backpack is? And is it okay for you to look on a computer to see where Sam's backpack is? Same items as before. Okay, so this time we wanted to see, because we wanted to look at the developmental sequence, we had separate groups for 4 and 5 instead of the combined 4-5. So we had 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6 to 7-year-olds, 8 to 10-year-olds, and college students. Everything was scored as before. When you separate out the 4-year-olds on this task, absolutely no difference whatsoever, and fairly high ratings. So it's fine for the owner of these items to track, and it's fine for the non-owner to track. It's good, in fact. At 5, we see a non-significant tendency to give higher judgments for the owner than the non-owner, but both were very positive. By 6 to 7, that was a consistent difference. By 8 to 10, that was a bigger difference. But it wasn't until college age that their judgment of the non-owner fell below this midpoint, which means that all the way up through 10, they're either positive about the non-owner tracking, or in the case of the 8 to 10-year-olds, they see it indifferently, neither positive nor negative. Here are the moral explanations, and you can see, there's a slight tendency to provide more moral more moral explanations when it comes to a non-owner tracking, but the difference really doesn't kick in until about 6 to 7. Okay, so to conclude, even preschoolers understand the functional value of digital tracking devices. They get how it's good. But privacy concerns and appreciation of potential dangers don't emerge until about 6 to 7. And even up through 10 years of age, children seem to be untroubled by a stranger tracking their possessions, or even themselves, you know, when the button's on their elbow, whereas college students view this as highly negative. Now, I've kind of framed this as a stranger tracking their possessions. In that last study, remember sometimes the participant was the owner and sometimes the stranger was the owner. We found no differences due to that factor, surprisingly. So like college students thought it was just as wrong for themselves to track a stranger as for a stranger to track themselves. Found no like main effector interaction involving whether the owner was the self or somebody else. So, so we get this, what looks like a developmental difference. We really don't know if this is a developmental difference or whether these are cohort effects. You know, it could be that as these younger children get older, they'll come to look more and more like the college students, and when these, you know, 4-year-olds are themselves in college, they will look just like our college sample. But it's also possible that there are cohort effects, and you know, the younger kids grew up in a different digital environment than the kids who are college students at the time of the study. And you know, I think about the fact that, you know, when I was a kid, if you had a diary, you kept it locked, hidden, and you know, the goal was for nobody ever to see it. And that's really different from our you know, practices, our social media practices. You know, oversharing was voted to be word of the year in Merriam-Webster in the year 2009. It's like our language is changing to reflect these new ideas. TMI, again, you know, a new expression that's now in the dictionary. Or these kinds of like joke memes. You'll always be one of a few hundred people with whom I feel totally comfortable sharing my deepest secrets. So, you know, there is potentially really, you know, different generations may have very different attitudes about privacy and just how much we should be concerned about that. So, how about for the future? I think that these findings raise questions regarding children's digital safety and security. So remember, I said at the beginning, there were, you know, we kind of started this project thinking, well, kids could be very sensitive to ownership rights and transfer it over to things like information. You know, you have rights to your own information and other people don't have that, given how sensitive kids are to ownership. Or it could change, you know, developmentally. And I had actually, in my own mind, thought that even the 4 to 5-year-olds were going to be very sensitive to this because, you know, young kids are so sensitive to ownership and ownership rights. And in fact, that's why we started with one age group, and it was our youngest possible age group that we could do with this method. Because we thought, okay, they're going to look very sophisticated. So I was quite surprised that even the 10-year-olds in the third study don't have the same intuitions about these situations. So without that skepticism, you know, potentially kids would be vulnerable to those who might exploit their digital footprint to track their location or obtain private information. Of course, you know, many people have written about these concerns. And of course, a question is how best to protect children, maybe by educating children about potential dangers, maybe providing clear guidelines and limits for how and when their phones and accounts should be shared. But I don't think it's immediately obvious what the solution should be. There's a sense in which we deliberately protect children from, the horrors of the world. I don't imagine that parents would be happy with the idea of, drilling into kids the dangers of kidnappers and so forth. So there's that balance of how to inform children while still, presenting a worldview in which they're open to other people and open to, the wonders of technology. Not obvious to me, at any rate, exactly how to solve this problem. And I wanted to thank my collaborators on this project, Natalie Davidson, Megan Martinez, and Nick Knowles, and all of the people who participated in the research. That's it. Yes?
Susan, it's kids. I mean, there's a tricky difference, right? If you know where my pen is, why would that bother me? Unless I think that my pen is always on me and allows you to make inferences about what I'm doing. But short of that, I mean, where's the damage when you know where my pen is? So did the kids see that? I mean, if the kids take this at face value, that somebody knows where my teddy bear is, well, that's fine.
Right. Well, so no, that's a great question. I think there are two pieces to it. So I think one issue with the kids, one reason why they're responding so differently, is they absolutely were not connecting up the dots, which the adults did immediately. Many of them said exactly like you did, like, well, and actually some people, not very many, but some of the adults' favorite object was a pen, for example. And they would say, well, if they're tracking my pen, I carry it with me, they'll know where I am. They would go through this whole chain of consequences. So I do think that that's a piece of it. Kids are not engaging in that multi-step kind of hypothetical reasoning about these various steps. On the other hand, a big chunk of what the adults said had nothing to do with consequences. It was like, and they would say, like, even if nothing happened, it's not okay. I feel creepy. What's wrong with that person that they would want to know where my stuff is? It's this real, like, moral indignation. Some of them were quite angry about just, like, the very idea. So, I mean, I think it would be, and we didn't do at all here, although the moral explanations somewhat give you a picture of that. We didn't separate out the kind of consequentialist reasoning from the more moral reasoning of the problem. So kids have no problem with the moral reasoning piece of it when it's with physical objects. Someone taking their toy, they see that as wrong, and they will flat out tell you that. But again, maybe for kids it's consequentialist again, because like I was saying, if somebody else takes your teddy bear, then you don't have it anymore. So my guess is that both of those components were different between the kids and the adults. Yes?
I wonder if there's some sort of locus of relatable, self-relatable fear. Like when you started, I was thinking, well, it makes sense because I think little children fear probably themselves getting lost more than they, or something happening to them more than they fear that something's going to happen to them by another person.
Yeah.
So maybe it would be good for them for someone to know where they are.
Right.
Right? Because.
Yeah.
But I wonder, and they have not yet at all learned if they're especially in their middle class neighborhood or upper middle class neighborhood where there's no out there fear yet. But if you were to do this experiment in a neighborhood where they've been exposed to dangers from the outside, I wonder if the locus of the vector for danger might be different.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think that would be like a really, really important additional step to take. I also wonder if, and I hadn't really thought about it, but you're right. I mean, kids kids do get momentarily lost, and I'm sure it's terrifying for them. So, I mean, if they're aware that they're lost. So I wonder if there's some way to separate that out, because they're so focused on the benefits of the tracking. They got that, you know, from the youngest age. So if there's some, you know, playing around maybe with different possible consequences of the tracking. You know, I haven't thought it through, but I think that would be like a very useful exercise. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking related to that, maybe asking them what they thought Sam or the other person would do with the knowledge. Because I was thinking the same thing with the teddy bear. Like, you definitely want someone to know where your teddy bear is, because then when it's lost, you
Right.
say, Mom, where's my teddy bear?
Right.
And she knows even if you don't.
And they
So-
talked about that a lot. They said it would be great if, like, it's like they didn't really seem to care too much whether they were the one who would be able to track the teddy bear or somebody else. They loved the idea that somebody, somebody could find a lost object. So yeah, that would be good to look at that.
Let me follow up on that and play devil's advocate here. I mean, the way you're talking about it assumes that some stranger who wants bad is able to somehow hack my tracker
Yes.
and knows where my phone is and hence where I am.
Right.
Well, unless I share that, only Google knows, right? I mean, so I'm one of those. I'm carrying a phone. I'm making full use of all Google services offers. And that means that Google in some way knows everything about me. But I'm also getting benefits, and I'm not particularly concerned that any particular person knows about me, because unless I share it, it goes into a huge database, and all it does is it delivers me ads.
Were you part of the Equifax hack?
Yeah, and it doesn't, and you don't even have control over the Equifax hack, right?
But it's
I'm not a
troubling.
customer of Equifax. Other people have delivered my data to Equifax. I never did anything with Equifax, and it can still be cracked. But
Right.
I should be terribly concerned about hacking things that actually deliver me a benefit. My benefits are multiple. My benefits are multiple, right?
Yeah.
So this phone, when I leave my car behind, I no longer have to worry about where my car is. It automatically registers when my velocity changes from driving to walking, and in the evening I just click on it and it tells me where my car is, and I click on the little man and it tells me how to walk back to my car, right? And it does that in cities where I do not know my way around. I no longer have to monitor this stuff. I'm traveling a lot, I like a restaurant, I mark it. I don't have to remember that 6 years ago when I was here, there was this great place. Google tells me, right? So there are lots of benefits that could potentially be hacked, but that are not exceeding the data about me that are out there, but which I have no influence. And the Equifax is perfect for that, right? Because there's a huge amount of data that are shared without our agreement, that are hackable. And Equifax acts like that was my risk as a customer, but I'm not their customer ever. My mortgage company was their customer, I wasn't.
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
So
Yeah.
people often in these situations when people share a lot, they actually share with people they want to share with. And in addition, the company has this stuff, but the company rarely ever wants to kidnap you. They want to sell you stuff. So I mean, there's a bit of a disconnect. I mean, we're making up these fantasies. We're making up these fantasies.
Can I just?
Where there's risks
Yeah.
that are not the intention of the product, but could happen in terrible cases. Yet those terrible cases happen without us contributing to them.
Yeah.
So there is a bit of a
No, that's a really excellent point. I think there is a disconnect. It reminds me of all the, the literature on risk perception.